The judge's face drained of color. He stared at the document in his hands. Then he looked at my parents. Then at me. Then back at the document. For 3 long seconds, nobody in the courtroom moved. Nobody breathed. My father's lawyer had been smiling all morning. That smile disappeared. The judge suddenly pushed back his chair, so hard it slammed against the wall. He stood. "Stop this hearing immediately." The room froze. His voice became even louder. "Nobody leaves this courtroom." A deputy near the door straightened instantly. The judge pointed toward the clerk's desk. "Call courthouse security now." My mother gasped. My father's face turned gray. And sitting at the defense table, I realized something. Whatever the judge had just found was far worse than anyone expected. 3 months earlier, I never imagined my own parents would try to take everything from me. Not my inheritance, not my savings, not my house, not even my retired military working dog. But that's exactly what they tried to do. And it all started with my grandmother's funeral. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, a major in the United States Army. For most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, served honorably enough, and proved myself often enough, eventually my parents would be proud of me. I was wrong. Some people don't want you to succeed, even when they're family, especially when they're family. The day of my grandmother Eleanor's funeral was cold and gray. The Montana sky hung low over the cemetery. A light wind moved through the pine trees surrounding the burial ground. I stood beside the casket in my black coat while Rex sat quietly at my side. Rex had once been a military working dog, a German shepherd who had completed 3 overseas deployments. He was older now, his muzzle was turning white, but he never left my side. My grandmother used to joke that Rex was the only man in my life she trusted. I smiled at the memory as the pastor finished speaking. The funeral itself wasn't difficult. Watching my grandmother suffer during her final months had been difficult. Losing her wasn't a shock. It was an ache, a quiet one, the kind that settles into your bones. My grandmother had practically raised me, especially after my parents made it clear that my older brother Michael was the center of their universe. Michael could do no wrong. If he crashed a car, it wasn't his fault. If he lost a job, someone was jealous. If a business failed, the economy was unfair. If I earned a promotion, I was showing off. That had been the family dynamic for as long as I could remember. Even standing beside Grandma's grave, my mother found a way to criticize me. "You didn't have to wear your army uniform to the hospital visits," she said quietly. I looked at her. "What? You always liked attention." I stared at her for a moment. My grandmother wasn't even buried yet, and somehow we were already doing this. I simply turned away. Arguing never changed anything. Later that afternoon, the family gathered inside my grandmother's attorney's office for the reading of the will. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and old books. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The attorney, Mr. Harrison, opened a thick folder. Michael sat across from me. My father sat beside him. My mother held Michael's hand like he was still 12 years old. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. The first few items were simple. Small donations to charities, a few gifts to friends. Then he reached the main estate. The room became very quiet as stated in the final will and testament of Eleanor Mitchell. Everyone leaned forward. My grandmother owned considerable assets. A ranch outside Bozeman, a lakeside property, investment accounts, several trust holdings. Nobody knew the exact value. Not even me. Mr. Harrison continued, "The entirety of the estate shall pass to my granddaughter, Sarah Mitchell." Silence. Absolute silence. I honestly thought I heard the clock on the wall stop ticking. Michael blinked. My mother frowned. My father slowly sat back. Mr. Harrison continued reading. My grandmother had left a letter, one specifically addressed to the family. He unfolded the paper, then read aloud. Sarah showed up. The room became still. When I needed rides to appointment, Sarah showed up. When I needed groceries, Sarah showed up. When I was scared at night, Sarah answered the phone. When I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, Sarah slept in uncomfortable chairs beside my bed. Love is not what people say. Love is what people do. Sarah earned this inheritance. Nobody spoke. Mr. Harrison folded the letter. Michael stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. This is ridiculous. My mother immediately agreed. Mom wasn't thinking clearly. The attorney's expression hardened. The will was reviewed 3 times and executed legally. My father crossed his arms. She manipulated an old woman. I felt something inside me crack. Not because of the accusation. Because none of them had visited Grandma in almost 2 years. Not one birthday. Not one hospital stay. Not one holiday. Yet somehow I was the villain. I left the office shortly afterward. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, deeply tired. That evening, I sat on the porch of my apartment with Rex lying beside me. The sun was setting. Orange light spread across the horizon. I rubbed the old dog's ears. You'd think they'd be happy. For me, Rex looked up, then rested his head on my boot. A week later, I learned the estate was worth nearly $8 million. The number shocked me. I had never expected anything close to that. I immediately hired financial advisors, tax professionals, estate managers. I wanted everything handled correctly. My military career had taught me something important. Success comes from systems, not luck. While Michael spent his life chasing shortcuts, I built plans, budgets, goals, discipline. The inheritance wasn't changing who I was. It was simply giving me more responsibility. For a brief moment, I believed things might calm down. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I arrived home after a long day at the Pentagon. The mail sat inside the box near my door. Mostly advertisements, bills, nothing unusual. Then I saw a certified envelope. My stomach tightened. I opened it immediately. The first page contained legal language. The second page explained everything. I read it twice, then a third time. I honestly thought I misunderstood, but I hadn't. My parents had filed a petition with the court. They claimed I was mentally incapable of managing my financial affairs. They requested legal guardianship over me, over my assets, over my inheritance, over my bank accounts, my vehicles, my property, everything, including Rex. I stood frozen in my kitchen. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Then my phone rang. The screen displayed my mother's name. I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said softly, "This is for your own good, sweetheart." I closed my eyes, and in that moment I realized my parents weren't grieving my grandmother anymore. They were hunting her money, and I was standing in the way. I barely slept the night after receiving the lawsuit. Not because I was afraid of losing. At least not at first. What kept me awake was the realization that my parents had spent weeks planning this. This wasn't an emotional outburst after Grandma's will was read. This wasn't grief. This wasn't anger. This was strategy. Every page in that filing had been prepared carefully. Every accusation had been chosen deliberately. Someone had spent a great deal of time building a case designed to destroy my credibility. And the people behind it were the same 2 people who had taught me how to ride a bicycle. The same 2 people who used to tuck me into bed when I was little. That was the part one couldn't stop thinking about. Rex slept beside my bed that night. Every now and then, he lifted his head and looked at me as if he knew something was wrong. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to panic. I wasn't going to lash out. I wasn't going to give them the emotional reaction they expected. I was going to fight the same way I'd fought every challenge throughout my military career. One step at a time. The first call I made was to an attorney. His name was David Brooks. Former federal prosecutor, mid-50s, calm voice, sharp eyes, the kind of man who seemed to notice things other people missed. We met that afternoon. David spent nearly an hour reading through the lawsuit. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment, didn't even frown. He simply read. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. How much of this is true? I laughed, not because it was funny, because the question itself felt absurd. Which part? The part where you're incapable of managing your life. I shook my head. I've held a top secret clearance. For years. He nodded. Keep going. I manage intelligence operations. Nod. I supervise personnel. Nod. I own my home. Nod. My credit score is over 800. Nod. I've never missed a mortgage payment. Nod. I've never declared bankruptcy. Nod. I've never been arrested. Nod. I finally stopped talking. David folded his hands. Then this case isn't about competency. What is it about? He looked at me for several seconds. Money. That answer came far too quickly, which told me he already knew. Over the following weeks, the situation became uglier, much uglier. My parents weren't merely claiming I lacked financial judgment. They were constructing an entirely different version of me. A fictional version. A dangerous version. According to court filings, I was unstable, emotionally fragile, socially isolated, unable to make sound decisions. One document even suggested that military service had left me psychologically damaged. That accusation hit harder than I expected, not because I was ashamed of serving. I wasn't, I never would be, but because they were using my service against me. Every deployment, every sacrifice, every difficult year, they had turned all of it into evidence. I began receiving copies of witness statements. The first came from an old neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years. Apparently, he believed I was withdrawn. The second came from a former classmate. She claimed I was obsessive. A third witness described me as unable to form healthy relationships. I stared at the pages, trying to understand how people who barely knew me could suddenly become experts on my mental health. David wasn't surprised. This happens more often than you'd think. It feels insane. It is insane. He paused. But that doesn't mean it can't be dangerous. The most troubling document arrived 2 weeks later. A psychological evaluation supposedly written by a licensed therapist according to the report. I displayed symptoms consistent with impaired decision-making. The language sounded professional, clinical, convincing at first glance. David read it carefully, then read it again, then a third time. Finally, he tapped a paragraph with his finger. Something's wrong here. What? This therapist never interviewed you. I blinked. How do you know? Because the report references conversations that never happened. A chill moved through me. The room suddenly felt colder. David continued reading, then pointed at another section. And this diagnosis contradicts itself. I leaned forward. What does that mean? It means either the therapist is incompetent. He paused. Or somebody wants this report to say something specific. That possibility stayed with me for days. Because if someone was willing to manipulate evidence, then this lawsuit was bigger than I originally thought. Meanwhile, my parents continued pushing forward. Every filing became more aggressive. Every accusation became more personal. The worst part wasn't reading what they said. It was realizing they genuinely expected people to believe it. One Sunday afternoon, my mother left a voicemail. I listened to it while sitting in my kitchen. Her voice sounded calm, almost caring. Sarah, sweetheart, nobody wants to hurt you. I closed my eyes. She continued, we just want what's best for you. I deleted the message before she finished. Then I sat silently for several minutes because despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe her. A small part of me still wanted parents. But reality had become impossible to ignore. The following month brought another surprise. Financial records, thousands of pages. David requested extensive disclosures from both sides. Most of it looked ordinary at first. Then one evening, he called me immediately. His voice sounded different, more serious. "I need you to come to my office." I arrived 20 minutes later. David spread several documents across a conference table. "What am I looking at?" He pointed to one file. "Your brother?" I frowned. "What about him?" "He owes an enormous amount of money." My stomach tightened. "How much?" David slid the paperwork toward me. I looked down, then looked again. The number didn't seem real. More than $2 million. Personal loans, business debts, private investors, judgments, outstanding obligations. The list went on for pages. I leaned back in my chair. How is that even possible? David shrugged. "Years of bad decisions." I stared at the documents. Pieces began fitting together. For the first time, I saw a motive large enough to justify everything. The lawsuit, the lies, the fabricated reports, the attacks. $8 million could solve a lot of problems, especially for someone drowning in debt, but we still lacked proof. Suspicion wasn't enough. The court needed evidence. A week later, I received something unexpected. An email. No sender name, no identifying information, no signature, just a single sentence. I read it 3 times, then forwarded it to David. The message said, "Check Guardian Wealth Holdings." Nothing else. No explanation, no context, just 5 words. That night, I sat on my porch with Rex beside me. The summer air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. I looked up at the stars and thought about Grandma. She always had a saying, "When people work this hard to hide something, it's usually worth finding." For the first time since the lawsuit began, I felt something shift. Not fear, not anger, determination. Because somewhere behind all these accusations, behind the fake witnesses, the suspicious therapist, the endless legal filings, there was a secret. And I had a feeling my brother was standing right in the middle of it. The next morning before sunrise, I opened my laptop, typed the company name into a search engine, and discovered something that made my blood run cold. The search results appeared almost immediately. Guardian Wealth Holdings. At first glance, it looked harmless. A private asset management company registered in Wyoming. Clean website. Professional branding, generic mission statement, nothing unusual, but years in military intelligence had taught me something valuable. The first layer is rarely the real layer. I started digging. Corporate records, business filings, ownership documents, public databases. By lunchtime, I found the first red flag. The company had been created only 4 months earlier. Less than 30 days before my grandmother died. I stared at the screen. That timing wasn't coincidence. The second red flag appeared an hour later. Guardian Wealth Holdings listed 3 corporate officers. All were hidden behind shell entities, which meant somebody was actively trying to conceal ownership. That alone wasn't illegal, but it was suspicious. Very suspicious. I called David. "You need to see this." He arrived that evening carrying 2 coffees and a legal pad. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing records. At one point, he stopped writing. "Sarah, what?" "I think somebody expected to receive your inheritance." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He pointed at the incorporation date. The company was formed before the will was read. A cold feeling settled into my chest. David continued. "That suggests planning." The word hung in the room. Planning? Not reacting, not grieving. Planning? as though someone already believed the money would become available. The next breakthrough came 4 days later and it changed everything. A forensic investigator David hired managed to trace several business registrations connected to Guardian Wealth Holdings. The trail eventually led to one name, Michael Mitchell, my brother. For several seconds, I simply stared at the report. Then I laughed, a short humorless laugh because suddenly everything made sense. The lawsuit, the pressure, the accusations, the timing, the inheritance wasn't the prize. Control was if a judge declared me incompetent. My parents could become legal guardians over my finances. If they controlled my finances, they controlled my inheritance. And if they controlled my inheritance, Michael's company would manage it. $8 million transferred into the hands of a man who couldn't manage his own checking account. I sat back in my chair trying to absorb the magnitude of what I was seeing. Then David asked a question, a simple one. How far do you think they're willing to go? I didn't answer immediately because I honestly didn't know. 3 weeks later, I got my answer and it terrified me. David called me late on a Thursday night. His voice sounded tense. Come to the office. I arrived 15 minutes later. The conference room lights were still on. Several documents covered the table. David looked exhausted. What happened? He slid a folder toward me. I opened it. Inside were copies of transfer forms, property authorization requests, financial management agreements. The signatures at the bottom all belonged to me. At least they appeared to. My stomach dropped. I knew immediately they were fake. Every single one. I looked up. What is this? David's expression hardened. These documents were prepared months ago. Months before the lawsuit, before the hearings, before any court decision. The implication hit me instantly. Someone had already prepared paperwork to move my assets as though they expected victory. As though victory had never been in doubt. I felt physically sick because this wasn't merely greed anymore. This was conspiracy. David pointed to one document. Look at the destination account. I did. Guardian Wealth Holdings. Every road led back to the same place. Every road led back to Michael. For the first time, I began wondering whether my parents truly understood what was happening or whether Michael had manipulated them. 2. The question didn't last long because 2 days later, I received my answer. A former employee reached out. His name was Jason Turner. He had worked for Michael's latest business venture. At first, he refused to meet in person. He wanted assurances, protection, confidentiality. Eventually, David arranged a meeting. We met at a small restaurant outside Denver. Jason looked nervous, constantly checking the windows, the door, the parking lot. Finally, he leaned forward. I shouldn't be here. Then why are you? He looked directly at me. Because your grandmother was a good woman. That surprised me. Apparently, Jason had met her several times. She had helped him during a difficult period years earlier. When he learned what was happening, he couldn't stay silent. Then he opened a folder. And my world changed. Inside were emails, financial projections, internal memos, meeting notes, dozens of documents, all connected to Guardian Wealth Holdings. One email included my father's name, another included my mother's, a third included Michael, and then I found the message that made my pulse race. It had been written by Michael. The subject line read, Post-Guardianship Asset Transfer Strategy. I read it once, then again, then a third time. There was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no innocent explanation. Michael openly discussed transferring inherited assets after a successful guardianship ruling. Properties, investment accounts, liquid funds, everything. He even estimated management fees Guardian Wealth Holdings would collect. I looked up slowly. Jason nodded. There's more. He handed over a flash drive, audio recordings, meeting recordings, Phone calls, internal conversations, hours of material. One recording stood above all the others. Michael's voice was unmistakable, clear, confident, smug. Once we get guardianship, it's over. Someone laughed. Michael continued, she'll never see it coming. My hands tightened around the table edge. I remembered every birthday Grandma spent alone, every hospital visit, every Christmas Michael skipped, and now he was planning to steal the legacy she intentionally left behind. David asked the obvious question. Who else knew? Jason hesitated, then answered, everyone involved. The room became silent because we all understood what that meant. My parents weren't victims, they weren't confused. They weren't being manipulated, they knew. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because I still trusted them. That trust had died months earlier. But because some childish part of me had continued hoping there was an explanation. A misunderstanding? Something. Anything. There wasn't. A week later, David organized every piece of evidence. Emails, financial records, recordings, corporate documents, the fake signatures, the suspicious psychological report, everything. The stack eventually filled multiple boxes. Looking at it felt surreal. My own family had spent months constructing an elaborate plan to take control of my life. And now they had left fingerprints everywhere. The trial date arrived faster than expected. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing a dark navy suit. Not my army uniform. This wasn't a military battle. It was a legal one. Rex sat nearby watching me as if waiting for orders. I knelt beside him, scratched behind his ears. You ready? His tail tapped the floor. For the first time in months, I felt calm, not because I knew what would happen, because I knew the truth. And truth has a strange kind of weight. Heavy, but steady. As I walked toward the courthouse later that morning, I saw my parents entering through the main doors. My mother avoided eye contact. My father looked angry. Michael looked confident. Far too confident. He smiled when he saw me. A smile that suggested he still believed he was going to win. I smiled back because, unlike him, I already knew how the story ended. The courthouse was already crowded when I arrived. People moved through security checkpoints. Attorneys hurried down hallways carrying thick files. Deputies stood near the entrances with practiced expressions. Everything felt normal, ordinary, which made what happened later seem even more unbelievable. David and I entered the courtroom shortly before 9:00. The hearing room wasn't particularly large. Dark wood paneling, American flag behind the bench. Rows of spectators seated quietly. My parents were already there. So was Michael, and sitting beside them was their attorney, Richard Harland, a man who never seemed to stop smiling. Even now, even after everything we had discovered, he looked completely confident. That confidence bothered me because experienced attorneys don't bluff unless they believe they have something. David noticed me watching. Ignore him. He looks awfully comfortable. David nodded, which usually means one of two things. What? Either he's very smart, I waited, or very stupid. I almost smiled, almost at precisely 9:00. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The hearing began. Richard Harland wasted no time. He rose immediately and walked toward the center of the courtroom. For nearly 40 minutes, he painted a picture of me that barely resembled reality. According to him, I was emotionally unstable, socially isolated, obsessively attached to my military career, unable to properly manage a large inheritance. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed, every word chosen for maximum effect. At one point, he even gestured toward me. Your Honor, Major Mitchell has spent most of her adult life in highly structured military environments. He paused dramatically, that does not automatically translate into the ability to manage complex personal finances. I watched him calmly, no reaction, no interruption. Years in military intelligence had taught me patience. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let people keep talking, especially when they're digging their own grave. Richard called witnesses one after another. The same people whose statements we had already reviewed. An old neighbor, a former classmate, a supposed mental health expert. Each told a version of the same story. Sarah Mitchell was incapable. Sarah Mitchell was struggling. Sarah Mitchell needed help. I noticed something interesting. None of them could provide specific examples. Not one. Everything was vague, general, carefully worded. The judge noticed too. His questions became sharper as the morning progressed. The psychologist in particular seemed uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. When the judge asked whether she had personally conducted certain evaluations mentioned in her report, she hesitated only briefly, but long enough. The hesitation hung in the room. David wrote something on a yellow legal pad, then slid it toward me. The jury isn't here, but credibility is dying. I looked down, then nodded slightly. The morning session finally ended. Court recessed. For lunch, Michael walked past our table on his way out. He leaned down slightly, just enough, so only I could hear him. "You should settle." I looked up. His smile widened. "Save yourself the embarrassment." Then he walked away. For several seconds, I simply watched him leave. David sat beside me. That sounded friendly. I laughed softly. He thinks he's winning. David's expression remained neutral. Good. That single word surprised me. Why? Because overconfidence makes people careless. The afternoon session began with our defense and everything changed. David stood, buttoned his jacket, then approached the podium. Unlike Richard, he didn't pace, didn't perform, didn't raise his voice. He simply started presenting facts. Cold, precise, relentless. The first surprise came when he introduced my military performance evaluations. Years of them, outstanding ratings, leadership commendations, strategic planning awards, operational management records. The judge reviewed them carefully. So did everyone else. David then presented evidence regarding my personal finances, mortgage history, investment accounts, credit reports, tax returns, savings records. The numbers told a very different story than the one Richard had spent all morning describing. No missed payments, no excessive debt, no reckless spending, no financial instability, nothing. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. David wasn't finished, not even close. Next came expert testimony, an independent forensic financial analyst, a nationally respected one. He spent nearly an hour reviewing my financial decisions. Every major transaction, every investment, every asset purchase, every financial strategy. Then David asked the question everyone was waiting for. In your professional opinion, is Major Mitchell capable of managing her finances? The expert looked directly at the judge. Absolutely. Richard stood immediately. Objection, challenge, cross-examination. None of it worked. The expert remained calm, confident, unshaken. Then came the moment nobody expected, including me. The judge requested a complete inventory of inherited assets. Not because he doubted me, because he wanted the record to be thorough. David handed over the documentation. The clerk delivered it to the bench. The judge began reading. At first, nothing happened. He simply reviewed the pages. Property valuations, investment holdings, trust structures, income reports. Then his eyebrows rose slightly. A subtle reaction, but noticeable. The estate was larger than most people realized. Much larger. Grandma had apparently been a far better investor than anyone knew. The ranch alone had increased dramatically in value. Several holdings had multiplied over decades. The total exceeded $8 million, possibly closer to 9. I noticed spectators whispering. Michael shifted slightly in his chair. My mother stared at the floor. The judge continued reading. Then he asked a question. A simple one. Major Mitchell, who currently manages these assets? I do, Your Honor, with professional advisors. Yes. He nodded, then returned to the documents. What happened next changed the entire hearing. Because while reviewing the asset records, the judge discovered something, a document buried within the financial disclosures. Something David had intentionally included. Something connected to Guardian Wealth Holdings. The judge paused, turned a page, then another. His expression changed slightly, not dramatically, just enough. David noticed it immediately. So did I. The judge adjusted his glasses, then began reading more carefully. The room grew quiet, very quiet. Even Richard stopped moving. A minute passed, then another. Nobody understood what was happening. The judge flipped to a separate attachment, then another, and another. The color slowly drained from his face. My heartbeat accelerated because I knew what those documents were. The transfer agreements, the forged signatures, the prearranged asset management plans. The paperwork prepared months before any legal ruling existed. The evidence David had saved. For exactly this moment, the judge kept reading. His jaw tightened. A deputy near the wall shifted his weight. Something felt different, wrong, dangerous. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed like pressure building before a storm. Then the judge reached the final section. The audio transcript. Michael's recorded statement. Once we get guardianship, it's over. Silence. Absolute silence. The judge stared at the page for several seconds, then slowly looked up. His eyes moved toward Michael, then toward my parents, then toward Richard Harland. Finally, they settled on David. What exactly am I looking at here? Mr. Brooks. David stood. His voice remained calm. Evidence of a coordinated plan to obtain control of Major Mitchell's assets through fraudulent means. Your Honor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge looked back down. Continued reading. Another page. Another page. Another. Then suddenly his face turned pale. Not surprised. Not shocked. Pale. As if he had just discovered something even worse than fraud. Something criminal. Something serious enough to stop the entire proceeding. And a second later, he pushed back his chair. The sound of the judge's chair striking the wall echoed through the courtroom. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The judge stood rigidly behind the bench, one hand gripping the document, so tightly the pages trembled. His face had gone completely pale. Not the look of a man surprised by a legal argument. Not the look of a judge hearing an unusual case. This was the expression of someone who had just uncovered a crime. A serious one. His eyes swept across the courtroom. From my parents to Michael to Richard Harland. Then toward the deputy standing near the entrance. His voice exploded through the room. Stop this hearing immediately. Every head turned. The clerk froze. A court reporter stopped typing. My mother visibly flinched. The judge pointed toward the door. Nobody leaves this courtroom. The deputy straightened instantly. Yes, Your Honor. Then the judge turned toward the clerk. His voice became even sharper. Call courthouse security. Silence. A stunned silence. The kind that seems to suck the air out of a room. My father looked genuinely confused. Michael didn't. For the first time all day. My brother looked afraid. The judge raised the folder. Mr. Brooks, are these documents authentic? David stood. Yes, Your Honor. Verified multiple times. The judge nodded once slowly, then opened another page. What I am looking at appears to be evidence of forged financial authorizations, forged signatures, fabricated medical documentation, attempted unlawful asset transfers, impossible conspiracy to commit financial fraud. A collective gasp moved through the gallery. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father looked at Michael. Michael looked at the floor. The judge wasn't finished, not even close. He lifted another document. This transfer package was prepared before any competency ruling existed. He flipped a page. This asset management agreement appears to assume a successful guardianship outcome before the petition was even heard. Another page. And this correspondence discusses transferring inherited assets into a privately controlled entity. He looked directly at Michael. Guardian Wealth Holdings. The room became absolutely still. Michael swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, there was nobody to rescue him. No parent, no excuse, no one willing to absorb the consequences. The judge looked toward Richard Harlan. Counselor, were you aware of these documents? Richard's face had lost all color. He stopped. The judge's expression hardened. Were you aware? No, Your Honor. The answer came too quickly, too desperately. The judge didn't appear convinced. Security officers entered moments later. 2 uniformed officers positioned themselves near the exits. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had started as a civil hearing now felt like a criminal investigation. My mother finally spoke. Her voice shook. Judge, there must be some misunderstanding. The judge looked at her. A long look, the kind that makes people regret speaking. Then he held up one particular email. The email, the one Michael had written, the one that outlined the entire plan. Mrs. Mitchell, your name appears repeatedly in these communications. Her face collapsed. My father immediately turned toward her, then toward Michael, then back toward the judge. Everybody suddenly wanted someone else to blame. The judge had seen it thousands of times. His expression never changed. David quietly leaned toward me. Watch what? The part where they stopped being a family. I hated that he was right. Within minutes, everyone began protecting themselves. My father blamed Michael. Michael blamed Richard. Richard blamed his staff. My mother claimed she didn't understand the documents. The more they talked, the worse things became. Contradictions appeared everywhere. Timelines stopped matching. Stories changed. Details shifted. Under pressure, the entire scheme began falling apart. The judge eventually raised his hand. Instant silence. Then he spoke very carefully, very clearly. This court is suspending these proceedings. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. He continued. The evidence presented raises substantial concerns regarding fraud upon the court, forgery, attempted financial exploitation, and possible criminal conspiracy. Every word landed like a hammer. My brother looked physically ill. The judge turned toward the bailiff. Preserve all evidence submitted today. Then toward the clerk. I want certified copies forwarded to the district attorney's office immediately. Another pause. And I am referring this matter to federal investigators. That last sentence hit hardest because forged medical documentation connected to military personnel creates problems far beyond a family dispute. Serious problems. Federal problems. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Not with a verdict, with an investigation. As spectators slowly filed out, I remained seated. I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. I felt exhausted, deeply exhausted, because no matter what happened next, there was no fixing this. No reconciliation, no family dinner where everyone apologized. Some damage becomes permanent. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. News travels quickly when court proceedings suddenly stop, especially when security gets involved. David and I exited through a side entrance. The afternoon sun felt strangely bright after hours inside the courtroom. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. You okay? I considered the question, really considered it, then nodded. Yeah, it wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I wasn't okay because I had won. I was okay because I had stopped trying to earn love from people who never intended to give it. That realization felt strangely freeing. The investigation continued. For months, federal agents interviewed witnesses. Subpoenas were issued, financial records were reviewed, digital communications were recovered, and the deeper investigators looked, the uglier the picture became. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the fabricated psychological report, the coordinated transfer plans, the concealed ownership structures. Every piece connected, exactly as David predicted. The guardianship petition was dismissed completely. The court formally recognized that I was fully competent. The ruling wasn't even close. Guardian Wealth Holdings collapsed shortly afterward. Several civil actions followed. Professional disciplinary proceedings began, and while I won't discuss every outcome, I'll simply say this: actions have consequences eventually, always. About 6 months later, I received a letter, not from a lawyer, from my parents. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter. For nearly 2 days before I opened it, the letter was 3 pages long. Apologies, regrets, excuses, memories, promises. I read every word, then folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. I never responded, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because some chapters deserve endings. And some doors close, for a reason. A year after the trial, I visited Montana. The ranch looked exactly the way Grandma remembered it. Golden grass, blue sky, mountains stretching across the horizon. Rex walked beside me, older now, slower, but still loyal, always loyal. We sat together on the porch as the sun began disappearing behind the hills. The same porch where Grandma used to drink coffee every morning. The same porch where she once gave me advice I'll never forget. People can take your money. They can take your reputation. They can even try to take your future. But they can never take your character unless you hand it to them. Back then, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Now I did. The inheritance had never been the real gift. The real gift was learning my worth didn't depend on anyone's approval. Not my parents, not my brothers, not anyone's. As the evening breeze moved through the fields, I scratched Rex behind the ears and watched the last light disappear beyond the mountains. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. And if you've ever had someone doubt you, betray you, or try to take away something you worked hard to build, I hope this story reminds you of one thing: never let someone else's opinion become your identity. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We share powerful stories like this every day. So, if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe and join us for the next one. Until next time, take care of yourselves and of the people who truly deserve a place in your